I appreciate you coming on and talking to us. I'm interested to where this conversation is going to go. But the reason why I wanted you to come on, I'm trying to talk to loads of different interesting people who have got something interesting to say. The reason why I started Incremental Gainz, which is my community interest company, it was inspired by a quote from Masashe, the Book of Five Rings. And the quote is, today is a victory over yourself of yesterday. Tomorrow is a victory over lesser men. And it's inspired Incremental Gainz. The tagline for Incremental Gainz is improve on yesterday, every day. So trying to get better, whether that's just 1%, trying to improve your life every day. And as that builds up, just small little incremental gains build up. And by 6 months' time, it's compounded, it's extrapolated, and you've improved yourself, whether that's physically, emotionally, mentally. And the whole way of improving yourself, you've got to step out your comfort zone, I think, anyway. You don't learn anything from staying in your lane or staying comfortable. You've got to get out of your comfort zone. I've always had an interest in philosophy and kind of theories behind things and why things are and all that. So that's why I've got yourself on today to talk about philosophy. And I didn't realise metaphysics was a philosophy, to be honest. I thought it was a science, but you can explain all that to us. So anyway, Rob, I appreciate you coming on talking to us.
Cheers for asking.
So you teach metaphysics.
Yeah, so I'm the head of philosophy and ethics at Turton School in Bolton, and we teach philosophy and ethics. So philosophy is like a huge subject that branches off into loads of different areas. So you have we teach the ethics part of it. We teach a little bit of metaphysics. We look at philosophy of religion. So it's quite a huge branch of things. But yeah, I know you were interested. You wanted to talk a little bit about metaphysics.
Yeah.
With it being, probably something that people hear it and they think it kind of sounds sciencey, and it kind of is in that way. But it's that can branch off into loads of different areas as well that you could talk about.
So is that like, I know we discussed it briefly before we started recording. So quantum physics is something that I think a lot of people might have heard of and don't really understand. Is that not the same as metaphysics then? I
have no understanding of quantum physics whatsoever. I couldn't really talk about quantum physics at all, but metaphysics is not really a branch of science as much as it's a branch of philosophy. It deals with what you call first principles. So if you like, I always try and explain it when I'm explaining it to like the kids at school, and we're trying to introduce it to them, and our A-level students who are studying it. We talk about science. If physics is the tree, then metaphysics is the roots of that tree. And if you like, in a pre-science world, which is where you find a lot of metaphysics in history,
right.
Before you had a real scientific understanding of the world, you had people just thinking about science and trying to come to an understanding of the world around them by thought experiment, because they didn't have the tools for real experiment. So things like Newton's laws of motion are considered metaphysics. So he's considered one of the greatest scientists, physicists of all time, but his fundamental theories, his principles that underlie it, the first principles of his science, we call metaphysics.
So would that be, try and understand it a little bit more, would that be, so he understands what's happening, but the science isn't understood behind what he's discovered? Is that the kind of
yeah. The things that are true through thought experiment or observation. So, for example, like Newton's first law of motion, which is still as true today as when he first wrote it, is no object is moved in itself but by another. In other words, like nothing can cause itself to happen, and that's just something that he observes from. For us, that sounds obvious. In a scientific world that we live in, but all our principles of science are based on top of that, built on top of those fundamental, simple principles of metaphysics. So that's kind of where that comes from. But that's just one kind of small part of it. But that's the basic idea of metaphysics: is that it's the underlying principles that you build on top of.
Right. So how do you? Because treat me as one of your what is it? A-level standard, is it? So
we do this at all levels. We do it from starting all the way down at year 7, but we really study it in depth at A-level. That's when we really get into it.
So take me way below that then. Take me as like year 1. How do you start to introduce these principles, and then to like a year 7 student? What sort of things you start looking at?
So, I mean, with the really young ones, because it's so abstract, you've got to kind of have a little bit of a hook with it as well. But I think one of the most important parts of metaphysics is where you look at knowing. So it's really like the four branches of it: time, space, knowing, and identity. So knowing is kind of like where philosophy begins. It's like the actual word itself. Philosophy means the love of knowledge. Philo is like platonic love, and then Sophia is knowledge. So it's and Socrates, who's kind of the main, often thought of as the founder of modern philosophy.
Yeah.
But really, you could argue about that. But he basically said that he's trying to argue where knowledge comes from, what our knowledge is, and he said the famous quote of "All I know is that I know nothing," which I think is a really important thing to instill in the kids straight away. So I always start with the idea of that everything that you think you know, how much of you really question that? How much of you really asked yourself the question of how sure you are? And that's basically what Socrates did. He's one of the only philosophers that never wrote anything down. All we know about him is what his student Plato wrote down. And he went on to start, and then his student Aristotle goes on to start the very first university, the academy in Greece, which is started studying philosophy. And basically what Socrates was doing was going around asking people in the world of ancient Greece, how sure are you about what you know? People believed in the gods. People believed in, that if I do this, then it will rain and we'll have a good harvest, and things like that. Yeah. And basically, he was just going around asking people the simple question of why. Why do you think that? And what he realized is that people really couldn't defend even the most basic of beliefs that they had, and actually they were, everything was based more on superstition than it was on belief. And Socrates was interested in founding a system that was based on absolute knowledge and working out what that even meant. And that's basically what philosophy.
Can you relate that to like how we live now then in the current climate with all this, like all the information coming at us? You think you know something, but what actually do you know about what's happening at the moment and who we are and what's going on and that? Could you relate to it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's probably more relevant now than it ever has been. That idea of all I know is that I know nothing. We've got. I mean, you've got people who think the world is flat. I know. I mean, people even today. I mean, 3,000 years on from Socrates, almost 3,000 years on from him, still have that same mentality of I'm right, which is in philosophy is a really, really dangerous mentality to have, which is I absolutely know this. And I think my first philosophy teacher said something that sticks with me, and I say it to all my students as well, which is, and it kind of sounds bad when you say it like this, and I do give a bit of an explanation with it, and it's nobody cares what you think. And it kind of stuck with me, but he did finish that with they only care what you can prove. And I think that's really important, is that there's a lot of this, and one of the first things I tell them is that, and it's nobody cares what you think.
Is that kind of where any laws came from then, and courts and stuff like that then? Because that's an important part of the justice system, isn't it? That what you can prove, we don't care what you know. Knowing's not enough. You need to be able to prove it. Has that affected that at all? I don't know why I just suggested.
I'm sure it has. Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure it has. I think philosophy's like kind of branched out into loads of different areas of society. But yeah, I think it's one of those things that that is probably still as relevant as when it was first said. So I start with that, and then obviously you want to then give them something a bit more concrete. It's not good enough just to say nobody cares about your opinion.
Get out! No one cares.
So it's where do we go with that then, and what does that mean? And I think one of the best ways of showing them that what they think they know actually might not really be the case is to look at philosophy of perception, which is an aspect of metaphysics. So have you ever thought about colour, for example? Like have you ever heard the philosophy of colour? Because I know you looked a little bit at philosophy.
I've read, and this might be total bullshit. You'll be able to correct me when I'm wrong. So I was reading something a while ago that whenever we see a rainbow, we're the only person who actually sees that rainbow, because colour only exists because of our retina and the light going through the rain droplets. So color only exists when there's someone looking at it. Is that correct?
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly that, right? So it's the idea of like coloring. What color essentially is a internal projection. It's your brain interpreting the different parts of the color spectrum. So like when you look at a rainbow, is again, science is not my strong point, but when light shines through a water droplet, it refracts and exposes all the color that's hidden within that. But really, it doesn't necessarily exist in the outside world. It exists only when, like you said, when it hits your retina and you get that internal projection of color. So I always get them to say, I hold up different colored things, and I'm like, what color's that? And they'll go red, and what color's this? And they'll say blue, etc. And but then we'll say, well, how do you know that? How have you learned how to give that name to that color? It's just a name that you ascribe to it. Your mum, your mum and dad sat you down when you were little and said, this is blue, this is red, this is green. But is there any real way of determining that my perception of blue isn't that? When I look at blue, I see your version of beige, or when you look at red, you see, because ultimately, like we said, because it's only an internal projection, we call it qualia in philosophy, independent.
Say that again.
Qualia, 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 right. And it basically means things that are incommunicable. I can't like, for example, if you try and explain the color blue, like if you try, you can't describe blue, you can't describe red. You end up saying weird things like it's the color of the sky, or it's warm, or it's cold. Yeah. And if you have somebody who was blind, who's been blind from birth, who's never been able to see color, there is nothing you could say. There's no language you could use to make that person experience that color in the mind.
So to try and bring it down to my level so I can understand it, say I'm describing the sky's the color blue. What I see in the sky might not be the color that you particularly see in the sky.
I might see your version of green, but there's no way we could ever determine that that's what we're seeing. If I look up at the sky and I see blue, and I've always learned to call that color blue, but because I can't communicate the concept of blue to you, and you can't communicate your version of blue to me, there's no way of determining that we we're perceiving the exact same thing. And there's other things that are qualia as well, but I think color is probably the best example. There's a great YouTube channel of a guy who's been blind since birth, right. And he talks about this and how people have tried to communicate colors with him for basically his whole life, and tried to say this is what red looks like or feels like, or things like that. And he's never and never will, unless he miraculously gains sight back, he'll never experience color. So I think like one of those is kids find that really weird, and some you see some people thinking,
I find it really weird, but I can't get my head off. So is another example, because another thought experiment that I've read up a little bit about is, and it's like it's an old kind of cliche, you hear it all the time, but if a tree falls in the forest and there's no one there to hear it, does it make any sound? And again, sound's a similar thing to sight in it, where it's disrupting the airwaves. Again, I'm not a scientist, so this isn't going to be right, but the tree falls, it makes disruptions in the air. But if there's no ear there to hear it, then
it's the similar. Yeah, it's the same kind of problem. I always forget who that is. It might be Confucius. I always forget who put that problem forward.
I've read it in one of the books.
It's quite a famous statement in philosophy, but it's basically the exact same thing. It's the same problem. It's qualia. We call it the explanatory gap in philosophy, which is a really hard one to bridge. Which is I'm trying to basically get across to the kids when I'm explaining it, which is that your perception of the world, you are concrete in your knowledge of it. Like Socrates says, what do you really know? How much can you really prove of what you know? And we walk around thinking that we're for certain that our perception of the world is exactly the same perception that other people are getting, that our version of the outside world is your version of the outside world is the same as my version, is the same as Jim's version. But actually it's not, it might not be that simple. We all have, these internal projections that we can't communicate. Maybe it's a failure of language. Maybe our language will evolve to a certain point where I can effectively communicate blue or sound or, what my version of my internal experience is. But
it's interesting that something that I spoke about in another episode that we did was There's a book that I've read by Stephen R. Covey, who's like a bit of a self-help guru. And in one of his chapters, there's a chapter called Understand Before Being Understood. So if I'm talking to you now, instead of me just projecting all my beliefs and my values on you, I want to try and understand where you've come from before I make myself understood. So that is like trying to understand your model of the world. So similar to what we've just spoke about, understanding why your values are your values, why your beliefs are your beliefs. Then I can start to understand you, and then you'll be able to understand me then. Because like you say, everyone's got a different, there is no reality, only the perception of reality, something like that, isn't it? That my model of the world isn't your model of the world because of the way we've been brought up, our influences. So I think it's important for people to understand, whether that's from a philosophical level or just in relationships in general, that the way I see the world is not the way you're going to see the world or somebody else.
Even at the most fundamental level, it's not the same.
Yeah.
And not in terms of your experiences, your upbringing and all that, but even maybe at the absolute most fundamental level of your literal perception of the world is not the same. So I think that probably, that's one of those things that, gives people a headache when they think about it. And, you don't,
doesn't it? I mean, there's a famous saying by Tony Robbins that confusion precedes learning. So when you're confused about something, it's the state before you actually start to learn something. Unconscious incompetence or whatever, it's something along those lines. But it should blow your head off, because like you should be thinking about these things. You should be trying to kind of like build your brain up to be able to handle these kind of questions and these thoughts and that as well.
Yeah. I think even just as a thought experiment is pretty useful, because it's just like it's not the most useful in terms of practical application. I'm not going to run around start trying to explain blue to people desperately, and it's but I think it's pretty useful just as a thought experiment, because it's a different way of thinking philosophy, that kind of hyper analytical way of looking at things is probably just a decent. I know you've been looking at the Stoics a lot though, right, in terms of actual, because I mean the joke of metaphysics is that it's entirely non-practical and useless. But that's Stoicism's not though, is it? I mean, Stoicism's designed to be useful. That's kind of like the whole point of it. So, I mean, what have you been looking at specifically with Stoicism?
So, I started looking at Stoicism. I was in the Ministry of Defence Police for about 11 years. I moved down to Reading when I was 23. Spent 11 years in the MOD Police. Moved back in 2015. So moved back to St Helens in 2015. And similar to the conversation we had with Jamie last week, but like the conversation was about Jamie, it wasn't about me. But similar to what he experienced, I had a loss of identity really. When I came out of the police, I was like Dave. My identity was Dave, who moved down south when he was 22, left St Helens, got a pretty good job, served in the MOD Police. That was my identity. So when I came out, I was like, well, who am I now? You know what I mean? Because I'm not Dave who's in the police anymore. I'm 30. How old was I? 30, 35 years of age. What do I do now? Who am I? And I can't remember how I got introduced to it, but I started looking at Marcus Aurelius, Seneca.
Yeah. Well, they're the main two, aren't they? They're your main two Stoics.
Yeah. So I started reading Marcus Aurelius, and I bought the Book of Meditations. And at the time, I was like, this is crap. I don't understand any of it whatsoever. Until I read into it and I realised what it was. That, I mean, you'll probably know more about it than I will, but it's his own little personal journal. It was never meant to be published. And bear in mind, for anyone who's watching, Marcus Aurelius was the most powerful man in the world at the time, the emperor of the Roman army and all that, wasn't he?
And he wrote that book in his tent at night, didn't he? When he was fighting, Germanic tribes on the edge of the known world. And
I find it fascinating that for a man with so much power and influence, you read this book and the thoughts that he's putting down are really like humble, and he's trying to connect with the people. He's trying to obey laws of nature. He's really like humble and that kind of thing. And reading through some of the passages, I started to get a few things out that I was experiencing, and then I started going on to Seneca because that was influenced by Tim Ferriss. I listened to Tim Ferriss's podcast, and he's a big Stoic. So he introduced me to some of the letters what Seneca written to his Lucilius or whoever it is who he written the letters to, and that kind of helped me discover, well, who are you? And I come to the conclusion that I'm not sort of my job. I'm not how much money we've got in the bank. And again, it's a cliche and all that, but I'm not the clothes that I wear. I'm the energy that I put out in the world. So what, you know what I mean? I am like my thoughts, and you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the work of, Seneca and Aurelius as well, especially Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, is some of the most important work that's ever been written in philosophy, and like the manner in which he wrote it as well. To think about what he produced and where he produced it is
mad.
Yeah, and I
so
think
stubborn, even though like you could argue that he written it like maybe 2,000 years ago or whatever it was, but it's still so relevant today and going like practical. You can literally, some of the passages are obviously he's talking about slaves and all that kind of thing that obviously isn't applicable today, but the stuff about like anxiety and your thoughts, your perceptions, anxiety. What's one of my favorite ones is today I escaped anxiety because I realized that it was within me all the time, or something along those lines, paraphrasing. But
yeah, that was they were really concerned with anxiety and anger. The Stoics, they were the two kind of things. I mean, especially Seneca was an advisor to Nero, Emperor Nero. Was almost the polar opposite of Aurelius. So like Marcus Aurelius, like magnanimous and like we're a man of the people, and wrote this amazing works of philosophy. And Nero was a horrific dictator who killed.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and eventually killed Seneca. He forced Seneca to commit suicide in front of his own family. That's how kind of Seneca came to an end. So there's
a famous. I can't remember what exactly it was, but Seneca, because he was such a stoic, when he was made to take his own life and commit suicide, he was still more concerned about his family.
Yeah.
Remaining calm and it's okay, like being like really objective about it.
Yeah, he had a bizarre quote, and it kind of sums up stoicism, but it's also like kind of a big misunderstanding of stoicism as well. I think, what did he say to his family now? It was something to the effect of don't weep for parts of life, the whole of it calls for misery, or something like that. So that's just kind of that stoic philosophy all over. But I think
can you talk a bit about that then, how it is so misunderstood?
Yeah, sure. I don't profess to be a expert in stoicism. I only, I don't really study it that much. I only know from bits that I've read. And Seneca more than Aurelius, really. But I know that the two main kind of areas that stoicism deals with is anxiety and anger. So they were around in ancient Rome. I think it was around about 6 AD to 64 AD. Seneca was around, so in the time of Nero. And the Romans were kind of like an angry, fiery group of people. And I think he wanted to just kind of like calm that down a little bit. And Seneca's philosophy became like really popular with the slave population, with the upper echelons of society. It was popular with everybody because it kind of resonated with them. But I think when you explain it briefly, it sounds really depressing, and it sounds like a really kind of pessimistic philosophy. But and then the further you kind of dig away at it, you realize that it's really not, and it's actually really useful, especially for with the the problem of anxiety that a lot of people have today, don't they? So so I think the fundamental principle of it is that hope is bad. So when you say it like that, it really doesn't sound like a useful philosophy at all. It's when people try and cheer you up, no matter how how nice they are, or how whatever how close they are as a friend, they'll say things like everything will be okay, everything will be fine, don't worry about it, things like that. And that was the enemy for Seneca and for Aurelius. That was the exact kind of thing that you wanted to hope, because I think what did he say now? It was anger and anxiety occur when misplaced hope for the future smashes into the hard reality of life. Basically something like that. So I'm paraphrasing him there, but that's the basic gist of it, is that it's everything will be okay, and then it isn't, and then that's where despair comes from, because the idea of stoicism is that it won't be okay, it will probably be bad. If you're worried about your job interview, tell yourself that this isn't going to go well, or at some point in my life this will happen, you know.
But I think it's important to have that almost being objective with it. So you say, you go back to the example of a job interview, it could go bad. So you're not going to be that naive to think, oh yeah, this is going to be wonderful, I'm going to get this job and that. So if you think to yourself, this could go bad, but then objectively look at the things that, because again, a big thing of stoicism is controlling the uncontrollables. Sorry, controlling the controllables. So everything that you can control. So you can control your preparation for that interview. You can research the company that you're going for the interview for. You can research interview questions. So you're as prepared as you can be. But that still doesn't mean you're going to get the job at the end of it. But if you can control what you can control and not worry about anything else, and you can be kind of at peace with that, can't you, a little bit?
Exactly, yeah, that's it. I mean, it doesn't mean don't prepare for it. It means exactly that. It means that, you know, if you're telling yourself that it won't happen or it will be okay, then you almost by definition aren't preparing for it. So like, I mean, like they give the example of like rain. You don't get angry when it rains. You don't start trying to punch the rain or start screaming and shouting, because you've learned to expect the rain, especially coming, you know, from England. You know that the rain is coming, and if you expect, the person who expects the rain will have an umbrella, and the person that doesn't, that says it's going to be sunny all day, won't have one. So it's that's the kind of basic idea of it. But it's oh sorry. I was just going to say, you can see that in jiu-jitsu, right? You can, you know, I'm sure you've seen a lot of people coming in who think, you know, watched a few UFCs and think this is going to be easy. I'll be all right with this. And then the hard reality of the sport smashes into their expectations of what was going to happen. And, you know, some people don't deal with that very well because of that. And, you know, I think, yeah.
And again, Nick, going back to that thing about controlling what you can control, a lot of time people look at, again, like say you're rolling with someone, which is sparring, for those who don't know, at the end of a jiu-jitsu class or whatever, and you look at the partner who you're paired with, and you look at maybe they might be a lot stronger than you, a lot bigger than you, but if you're objective and not think about what they're trying to do, and you try and implement your own game, whatever that game may be, and think about the steps needed to maybe escape a position, you're not worrying about someone else you can't control. You just need to control your breathing, think about the steps needed to escape the position, and have that kind of white belt mentality all the time, that it's okay to lose sometimes, it's okay to fail and get things wrong, as long as you're trying to get better all the time.
And that it will happen, you will fail. That's the, you know, the mentality you've got to have, like for almost anything, isn't it? Like, you know, you're not gonna, if you're a 100-meter sprinter, you can't just say I'm going to run as fast as Usain Bolt straight away. You know, you've got to tell yourself that I'm going to be crap for at least a decent amount of time, and then within that you can plan realistically, you can prepare realistically for things. And
I've been reading quite a bit. So like I said, I was reading stoicism quite a bit. I got really into stoicism. Ryan Holiday is another author who he written Ego is the Enemy and the Obstacle is the Way. So if something is impeding your progress, then that is the way you've got to go. So you don't, I don't know, for example, how can I use it as an example? So say setting up these podcasts, if I had anxiety about maybe listening to my own voice or seeing myself on camera or nervous about what I was talking about, that's the reason why I didn't do them. So that is the obstacle. Then that is the way I've got to go. Do you know what I mean? The obstacle is the way. That is the way I'm going to grow. I'm going to get better by going towards the obstacle and not diverting around it. Because that obstacle is always going to be there, isn't it? I'm always going to have these anxieties, these fears, whether it's fear of failure, fear of looking stupid. If I don't go towards the obstacle, then them fears are always going to be there, aren't they?
Yeah, exactly. That's Seneca as well, right? Absolutely, yeah. That's you know, you should expose yourself to it. It's not even just about preparing for it. It's purposefully exposing yourself to it. I think he said something ridiculous like, wear rags and drink the water out of the bowls that animals drink from and stuff like that.
That's in one of his letters about dealing with Sophia. What's the word now? Almost like fear setting. So if you can think of the worst thing possible, even in this current climate now, so say people are fearing for their jobs, people have lost businesses, but if you almost set yourself up for the worst case scenario, so like you said, Seneca dressed in rags for a week at a time, he ate rice and beans or something like that.
Yeah, that's the one. Yeah.
He slept on the floor, and afterwards he thought, well, obviously I'm paraphrasing, and he was like, that wasn't actually that bad. So the worst thing that I envisioned wasn't actually really that bad. So anything else that happens, I can handle it. So.
And he asked you to do that pretty regularly as well, right? Like doing, I think he said like every year or something like that, live out the harshest conditions that you can possibly, and probably not like the most relevant to do it exactly like he was doing it today. But the principle's there, isn't it? I think it's really important is to expose yourself to the hard path and not necessarily take the easy route. Have you listened to any Jordan Peterson?
Pardon?
Have you listened to any Jordan Peterson?
I was just going to mention him then because I've been, I kind of adrift. So I went from stoicism. I still try and adopt a lot of stoic philosophy in my life and the way I live and that, like, but that sort of just, whatever you want to call it, I just ended up gravitating towards Jordan Peterson. He was on Rogan a few times. I read his book, the 12 Lessons of Life or whatever, like.
Yeah, 12 Rules for Life.
12 Rules, sorry, yeah. And a lot of one of the things that really sticks out is that he's a big proponent about suffering. Life is suffering. I know that's quite a Buddhist philosophy as well, but doing the hard route, taking the hard route. Life is not easy, is it? It's all about suffering and being comfortable in that uncomfortableness almost, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. That jiu-jitsu quote of "get comfortable being uncomfortable."
Yeah.
What John Peterson's saying, because at some point, he says something like the storm will come. Right, there's a storm for everybody at some point, and it's however exposed you are and however ready you are, and it's a really stoic kind of philosophy that he has there. But I think that's really
valuable, isn't it? It's valuable, yeah.
Yeah,
because everyone's dealing with adversity every day. You one of the things that I'm starting to come around again, looking at this, how my model of the world is different to your perception of the world, and that everyone's dealing with stuff that people don't know anything about. So like what I'm dealing with behind closed doors, nobody else knows. Same with you, same with everybody's going through these little storms or little facing adversity on a daily basis. And life is hard, isn't it? At the end of the day, like, I'm not trying to fool anyone. Life isn't a film that's going to be like the Rocky story. Life is hard, and there are going to be struggles and pitfalls, and
I mean, we're talking about that being the underlying philosophy of Buddhism as well, which is true, and it's pretty much the underlying philosophy of most religions, even Christianity.
The idea of suffering. Do you mean that? Yeah.
Yes, I mean, I think it's one of the most useful parts of philosophy. So I'm not a religious person at all. I don't know if you are, Dave, or if you. No, same. I'm not religious at all, but I find that one of the most useful branches of philosophy is philosophy of religion, specifically looking at the idea of evil and suffering, which is it's just kind of linked to what we were just talking about there with the Stoics and with Jordan Peterson's specific outlook, because I know he's a Christian, isn't he? But he has a unique kind of look at perspective on Christianity. But it's the problem of evil and suffering in philosophy is basically that if a God exists that's loving and compassionate and all powerful, then that God should observe your suffering and snuff that suffering out immediately, and there should be no suffering if a God exists. And the responses to those, because obviously Christians kind of have responded to that over the last 1,000 years, and maybe even further back than that, maybe even further back than Christianity as well. The way that they respond to it is to basically rationalize suffering. Why do people suffer? What's the purpose of suffering? And even if you take God out of that equation, those answers to those questions were some of the great philosophers of all time are trying to rationalize suffering. Right. End up being some of the most useful and actually helpful philosophies, even if you're not trying to prove that God exists, even if you're just answering it, what's the purpose of it? So like a modern philosopher called Richard Swinburne he was thinking specifically about God and trying to prove that God exists, but the modern philosophers kind of take this different way with it, and he was saying that if you don't have suffering, if you don't have real suffering, then you can't have real good in the world either. So, for example, like you can't have generosity can only exist, or charity can only exist when there's poverty.
Yeah, poverty.
Yeah, you can't have. There's no such thing as the good without the suffering that goes with it as well. So
it's kind of like balance, like the yin and the yang, that idea, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, basically, it's but yeah, I think you know, as his kind of like contemporary as well, John Hick would say like it's the whole purpose of you being here is to suffer and grow through it. He called it growing your soul, is what he actually called it. But it was the idea of that, you know, if you're supposed to expose yourself to the difficult route, and if the world was easy, and if the world had absolutely no suffering in it, then it wouldn't even be a world worth living. It would be a world that was entirely immoral. There'd be no morality at all, because there would be no opportunity for morality. There'd be no opportunity for good without evil. So it's
what was the term? Growing your soul, is that what you said?
Yeah, he call it, it's John Hick, he's called, but he was speaking about it in terms of, obviously he's still trying to prove, he's a Christian, he's trying to prove the existence of a God and evil and suffering at the same time. But a lot of that, his philosophy is really useful. And you know, but yeah, he called it growing your soul. Oh,
right. Sorry, Olga's just made an appearance. Hello. Growing your soul, like that. I'm gonna. What's the guy's name? John Hick.
John Hick. Yeah, John Hick. He's called. It was just some really interesting philosophy about, you know, about this. It kind of takes it a step further than the Stoics, if you will, and it's not just about predicting and being realistic about suffering for the future. It's that it's absolutely essential for your happiness. It's absolutely essential for good in the goodness in the world at all. It's almost like a paradox. You can't have it without. You can't have any goodness. You can't have any morality without suffering. So it's like a step further than the Stoics, if you like.
So that's kind of Jordan Peterson's stance, isn't it? He talks about all that, doesn't he?
Yeah, you can see him being a Christian. He's probably massively influenced by Hick. I bet he know a lot about Hick and Swinburne. So
I quite like. I've tried to listen to some of his lectures on iTunes as a podcast. He does lectures, and they're not, obviously he knows what he's going to say, but they're not like pre-scripted in terms of he reads. He has an argument with himself during his. I don't know if you've listened to any.
Yeah, I've listened to a few on YouTube.
He kind of like he's having this back and forth with himself when he's trying to argue and present these concepts and these ideas about God, about what it really means, and using. What I'm really interested in is like the myths. I'm not, like I said, I'm not really religious, but listening more to Jordan Peterson about the way he tries to explain the First Testament specifically, the stories, how the myths behind these stories and what they're really like trying to explain, and parables, what they actually stand for and how we can relate to them. I find that fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think his interpretation of the Old Testament is really interesting, because he doesn't really believe in God, but he's a Christian. Mm-hmm. It's a really weird perspective on Christianity. Yeah. He almost views the whole thing as like a psychological map, really, of you know, I mean, if you look at like and he talks about this with the Adam and Eve story. You know, I mean, people often cite the Adam and Eve story, and again, I'm not a Christian or anything, but you know, people often cite the Adam and Eve story and go, you know, religion, load of bollocks, because you know, how can you have a talking snake? And we know the first two, but all the evidence suggests that it was never meant to be taken literally true. And
it's a story that is relating a deeper message within it.
Yeah, and the message is evil and suffering for Adam and Eve. That's the kind of point of that story is why do we suffer? And the ultimate point of that, whoever wrote that way before Christianity, because that's a old Hebrew text, maybe even older than that, is that it's us, we suffer. Where the Adam and Eve are a metaphor for every human being, and the talking snake that convinces them to eat the apple from the tree is the voice of temptation in your head that tells you to not do, or to do the thing you absolutely know you should or shouldn't do. So it's
without that test, almost, then we'd have the life that you spoke about earlier, where without the suffering, there's no enjoyment of anything, there's no reward from anything.
Yeah,
it's this like banal life that doesn't mean anything if there's no like good, bad, suffering, all that kind of thing. Yeah,
you have to have both, right? You have to have that balance of both. But yeah, I mean that old Testament story that most people will just write off. I think it's, you know, there's definitely something to that. There's definitely something interesting in that idea of like everyone's got that snake in everyone's got that voice of temptation that says, you know, just don't go to, you know, class tonight, or just and the stuff, and everyone can relate to. You feel so much better when you ignore that voice, and when you don't ignore that voice, that is suffering. That's where you're.
because there's a lot of people who have different terms for that inner voice. So like Joe Rogan refers to it as your inner bitch. There's Steve Peters who calls a chimp the chimp paradox.
Yeah.
You've got I think Will Story, written The Science of Storytelling, calls it the inner narrator because it's trying to make stories up.
Yeah.
There's loads of different kind of terms for this.
Yeah.
Whether it is the inner temptation to have a day off, or like
exactly. And I think like the fact that somebody wrote that story, which is basically that's what the Adam and Eve story is Joe Rogan's inner bitch is basically that story. To think that somebody wrote that 3,000 years ago and had that kind of insight into human understanding, one, shows you that we've not really changed that much, and two, there's probably some useful stuff somewhere in that book. So
is that the stuff you try and, because you said you teach philosophy, religion, and ethics? Is that what you said? You teach?
Yeah.
So is that how you try and teach the religion because you're teaching religion without being religious yourself?
Yeah.
Is that kind of the stuff that you try and put across to the students, that there's a deeper understanding without actually believing there's an all creator who created the whole earth, and that there's a deeper understanding behind it all?
Absolutely, yeah. That's exactly the way that I go at it. Yeah, 100%. It's the only way. I think more 90% of kids are atheists, and pretty at that age, like I was as well, and I'm sure like most people were when they were kind of 14, 15, were pretty strong atheists with really strong views. And I think if you just go in and start teaching it without putting it into some kind of context and some and it's probably the most important way to look at it as well. But yeah, that's exactly how I go at it. I just I try and explain it as how this is useful and how you can derive something out of it even without believing in a God.
Yeah, it's like when you said before that, what was the statement in philosophy, that you know nothing, that you know nothing.
All I know is that I know nothing.
All I know is that I know nothing. So, because I often refer to myself as like an atheist. So let me get the definition of an atheist is that you don't believe in a God. Is that correct?
Yeah. It's probably more accurately is you believe in the non-existence of a God. So to say that you don't believe.
Sorry, go on. Say that again.
A theist believes in God. An atheist believes that there isn't one. And if you don't believe in a God, you will probably classify yourself more as an agnostic, because it doesn't mean you believe that there's definitely not one either. If that makes sense. An atheist doesn't have a question about it. There's no does a God exist? They don't question the idea of God. They say that there is no God. And a theist said that, again, wouldn't have a question about it, but would say there is a God. And
so
that
agnostic would be there is something, but they don't know what it is.
It's just more of a kind of I don't know position, and I think.
Right. So I'd say I'm more agnostic then. I would say I'm more agnostic, I
think most people are. Most people are, because it's not something that you can necessarily.
Original question, in it, what we said at the beginning, or you said at the beginning, that I know that I don't know. How can you say really that there is no God? Definitely, you know what I mean? Yeah. We don't know, do we?
Yeah, exactly. And it's it's like you should, there's an argument called Russell's teapot in philosophy as well, which is basically the idea that you shouldn't believe in something just because you can't prove its non-existence either. So, but also you shouldn't disbelieve in something just because you can't. You get the idea, right? So
so is that the what is it? What they refer to? The evidence of. Oh, it doesn't matter. I'll come back to that. I can't remember what they referred to it as. Something like the evidence that something doesn't exist, rather than the evidence that. Oh, never mind. I'm confusing myself with that. Go on.
What you're going at though, and it's basically that point is that like maybe the most logical, it's seemingly the most logical position to take is agnosticism. But most people classify themselves as atheists, and they're actually agnostic. A lot of people, especially like younger ones, who just because they've never heard the word agnostic, they know what atheist means. And the parents have said we're an atheist family or whatever. But actually, most people, especially if you're kind of like like you, open-minded, and you like to really, you've studied philosophy, and or if you're just the kind of person who just, is not. I
don't think you can't be that knowing that everything, like not knowing, but being open-minded enough to realize that we are not the be-all and end-all. That we don't know if there's something else. You can't be that, like, what's the word? Just concrete that, like, yes, there isn't a God. There's nothing else there.
Yeah.
I think I'll be open-minded. That was what I was trying to say before. The evidence of absence and the absence of evidence.
Oh yeah, that's it. Yeah, yeah. The evidence of absence is not the absence of evidence.
That's
Also,
right, yeah.
Yeah.
Something like that, yeah.
Well, yeah, what you were saying then is literally what philosophy is. That is exactly what philosophy is the idea of, you know, of being open-minded, of admitting that it might not be, you know, you absolutely don't know, and you know, the majority of things. And what philosophers try and do is to build on as much as they possibly can what they think is true knowledge. So it's more of a knocking down process at the start, philosophy, and then a building up process afterwards. But that's
what was it that Richard Dawkins said? I think it was in the. Have you read The God Delusion?
I've never read it, no, but I know quite a bit about Dawkins. I've never read it, but
didn't he say that? Again, this isn't my opinion. Like, it's just what I read. What he said. If you are religious, by definition, you're an atheist because you only believe in your God. All the other gods don't exist in any other religions. So,
yeah.
If you are religious and you're Christian and you believe in one God, by definition, you're an atheist because no other gods exist.
Yeah, it's Ricky Gervais said something similar to that as well. He said some guy said to him, "I don't understand how you can't believe in God." And he said, I don't believe in God this exact same way that you don't believe in the 99,000. I just do one more than you. So, yeah. But yeah, I thought that, like, you know, philosophy of religion for most people is something that they go, oh, switch off. You know, I don't believe in God, so this isn't relevant to me. And you know, I did that at first when I started studying it in university, and I just thought the particular module I was doing, I just thought it wasn't relevant, and I actually found it by the end to be the most relevant. I thought it was the most interesting. Yeah. By the end of,
so is that how you got into it then? You took maybe like a lesson and something really resonated with you, and you was like, there's a deeper understanding here, what I'm not really switched onto, and that's just how you got deeper and deeper into it. Yeah.
Yeah. I had a really good teacher for GCSE RE who basically just decided that she was going to do philosophy with us, and then she went on to champion philosophy in schools and ended up writing the course that I'm teaching now. Right. So and I've ran into her, or ended up getting in touch with her not too long ago, actually, for the first time since I left school. But I had she was a brilliant teacher, and then I went to college and I had a fantastic A-level teacher called Jamie Swan who introduced me to metaphysics and you know, and philosophy of perception and some of the stuff that we talked about today. That kind of goes all the way back to A-level. And then for some reason, when I started university, I decided I was going to do business studies in university. I don't know why. I do know why, because everyone told me you'll never get a job with philosophy. So, which is kind of true, to be fair. So, I did business, and then it just wasn't for me. It just wasn't. It just didn't sit right with me, and I barely attended, and then I decided I was just going to go back and redo my first year, and I moved in and studied. I went and begged the philosophy department to let me on, because I'd proper wasted my A-level and really didn't do that well at A-level. So I had to grovel a little bit, and for some reason they decided to let me on. And then I never looked back. It was probably the best decision I've ever made to go and do that. So
going back to metaphysics, I want to hear you talk about, because something that fascinates me, but I haven't got a clue about the concepts behind it. But you said one of the founding sort of tenets of metaphysics, one of them's time. Is that right?
Yeah.
So how is time thought about in metaphysics? Because when I've tried to read stuff about like Einstein and the theory of relativity and all that, and talk about time, it's not time as we know time, is it?
Yeah. I mean, this is not my area of expertise.
Sorry,
it's more I'll be completely honest with you, Dave. This is not something I know a whole lot about. I know I've seen the film Interstellar though. And, seen that film by any chance? That's about as much of a scientific understanding of time that I've got there. But it's I look more at the kind of knowing and identity side of things. But
talk about identity then, because that's another thing that interests me. Does it mean identity as in us as humans, how we identify with each other, or is there a deeper
Yeah, kind of. Something you were talking about before kind of made me think about it. Do you remember you were saying, when you'd finished with the police and you felt kind of lost and you weren't sure kind of where, who you were. That's a really big problem in philosophy as well, is who are we? What are you? And there's a few different, that's been tried to be answered throughout almost every generation of philosophers. But there's I can't remember what the actual proper word for the problem is, because I always use the Sugar Babes as an example. Do you remember the band the Sugar Babes?
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
Well, they eventually had they kept swapping people in and out until eventually they were. This is the most bizarre example I use, but I use it all.
I did not think that we were going to end up talking about the Sugar Babes, to be honest, in this conversation.
You can't not talk about the Sugar Babes. But I don't think I've ever listened to a Sugar Babes song. But it's they had people kind of leave the band one by one until eventually they were a completely different band. And sometimes we use the example of a bike, right? So if you have a bike that's your bike and you give the bike a name, you call the bike Harry or whatever, and you love your bike, it's your bike, you know the bike, and your bike has an identity because you've given it one. It's Harry, it's your bike, and then you change the handlebars on it. And is it still your bike? Is it still Harry?
I've just thought of the best example ever for that. You remember Only Fools and Horses? When Trigger wins an award for having the same broom, because he's a road sweeper, isn't he? He wins an award for having the same brush for like 30 years and saving the council money. And he's like, I've had the same brush for 30 years. It's had 23 new heads, 15 new handles.
Exactly. Yeah. But it's a problem with this. It's the same with us, right? We're not the same. We change ourselves piece by piece. Even at a physiological level, every cell in our bodies at 7 years or something like that. Every single cell in your body is completely different than it was before. You're not the same person.
Your skin is constantly like falling off and replacing itself and growing, isn't it, and all that. Even like at a cellular level, yeah. Wow. Yeah.
So
what's
I mean,
what's the famous? If a man will never step in the same river.
Same river twice. Yeah.
It's not the river, and it's not the same person. Yeah.
That was some ancient Greek philosopher, I think. I can't. Heraclitus, I think it might have been.
Oh right.
But yeah, we think about ourselves as a solid thing. I'm me, and I've always been me. But that might not be the best way of looking at things. The best way of looking at it might be to say that I'm not the same person as myself, even from year to year. It might get into a problem though if you take that too far and you say I'm not even the same person as that I was a moment ago.
Yeah.
So this is where's the hard thing is, where's that balance of of what you think of yourself as. You think of I think of myself as a teacher, but then if I leave that profession, am I still me? Am I a different person now? Or if you leave your partner who you've been with for a long time, are you still the same person? And that might not even be a question that makes much sense to ask yourself who you are as a person. But it's
is there a definitive answer then to it?
That's philosophy, isn't it? There's no such thing as definitive answers. That's why people think it's entirely useless. But I mean, Jean-Paul Sartre is one of the great 20th century philosophers from France. He was, I don't know if you've heard of existentialism.
I have heard of it, but I don't really know what it is. But I think I have heard the word, like, yeah.
So they were really concerned with like identity and kind of who you are. And Jean-Paul Sartre basically said that what we're doing is we're acting. Everything's acting. There's no such thing as identity. It's not, you are basically, you call it bad faith. So he said he was in a cafe in France watching the waiter be a waiter. He was acting, doing all the things that a waiter should do. And we basically do that in every aspect of our life. When you're with your friends.
Environment. We're a different person in a different environment. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. And there's no such thing as a constant identity. It's not that you change from, over time. It's that you change immediately depending on the situation that calls for it. But it's conscious as well. You are like consciously acting.
Because I mean, I'm a different person at home with my wife than I am with my mates if we're out
Yeah, of course you are.
socialising. I'm a different person stood in front of a jiu-jitsu class than I am when I'm at work, sat at my desk.
Yeah.
So yeah. So, but I'm every different role. That is me. But yeah, I'm not that role when I'm in at home with. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's like there's no such thing as you. It's basically what Sartre's trying. Again, I don't know much about Sartre. But it's kind of a simple understanding, but it's not. You know, it's almost a stupid question to say who are we? You just basically what we are for Sartre is actors. We're bad actors moving from one role to another constantly, which is kind of not the happiest of philosophy, but.
I'm getting the gist that a lot of philosophy is quite like, I know there's a bigger picture and a bigger meaning, but on the surface they're all quite depressing, aren't they?
Yeah, it's pretty bleak.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty bleak, to be honest. Most of philosophy, but like I said, it's usually like what we've kind of been talking about is like the first parts of everyone's philosophy, if you like. And like I said, philosophy at first is knocking down. It's kind of breaking down what you think is the reality of something, of identity, of knowing, of space, of whatever, of evil and suffering. Break down the reality of it first, and then build up some kind of theory out of that, as opposed to just kind of leaving it in tatters. So like Sartre won't leave it there. For example, he'll it's like, well, what do we do about that then? What's the way to live in that world then if we are doing that? But it's yes, it is pretty bleak for the most part, though. I'll admit that. It's not the cheeriest of subjects, which is why I like the Stoics, because they sound bleak. And that's why I like the Stoics, because they sound bleak, but actually it's pretty useful.
I think that's the misunderstanding, isn't it? Where when people think of Stoic, and it like you think, oh, my parents were Stoic, which meant they didn't show any emotion. They had a stiff upper lip.
Yeah.
There was no like nothing. You know what I mean? There was no like sitting down talking about stuff. Everything was like, carry on regardless, don't show any emotion. But actually, when you read more into it, it is quite compassionate, and it is thinking about things objectively in your behaviours. Why do you behave in that way? Questioning your behaviours and all that kind of thing. It is more than what people perceive it to be, I think, on the surface.
Yeah.
But, really inspired. We went to, before all this corona epidemic kicked off, we went to Rome. I've never been to Rome before, but we was in Rome like January, February, and we've got all the wonderful sort of historical sites around Rome, the Colosseum, the Vatican. We went and did all that. The one thing on my list I wanted to see, Marcus Aurelius' statue. That was the one thing that I wanted to see. Like, and we
Where is that? Where is the statue?
So the original statue, there's only one left, one remaining at the moment, and it's in a museum. So the Capitol Hill, where there's the big sort of building on top of Capitol Hill.
Yeah.
There's a museum there, and the actual original statue is in there. He's on his horse. I'll send you a picture of it after that, but he's on his horse in the museum. But a replica of it is in the courtyard outside of this museum, just on Capitol Hill. And
isn't it? It's a great city.
Brilliant. Yeah.
Did you go to the Forum?
Pardon?
Did you go to the Forum?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? Looking at.
Like we went the first day. We was at the I can't even remember what it's called now. The Gladiator.
Oh, Colosseum.
Yeah, I couldn't get my words out then. Went to the Colosseum, and we had a few of the tall things on there and that. And what I didn't really know, and you might know more about this than me, like, because you've got an interest in history as well, haven't you?
Yeah.
I just assumed that it was built and always used for gladiatorial combat, but it was actually a church more than it was a site for like gladiatorial fights and that, wasn't it? Yeah, it was a church. I was like, so it was only used for a short space of time as a games sort of arena. Yeah.
He put plays on and all sorts of things there, didn't he, as well? I thought it was crazy that he filled it up with water and did like reenactments of naval battles.
I know.
Flood the whole bottom of it, and it was
really
crazy.
By that, I know. And then on this tour, you can see where like the cross is in the middle of the ground and that, and where like the altar would be. And I was like, wow, I just assumed that it was always used for the gladiators,
yeah,
not as a church. And I was quite blown away by that, actually. Like, Because I've always grew up like thinking about the gladiators and Sparta and all that. I've been obsessed by stuff like that, and it wasn't like it's only been used for a few, maybe like I think it was 70 odd years. It was used as a gladiator.
Yeah, not that much.
Grand scheme of things, not that much at all, is it? No, not.
Just think it's amazing looking at what those guys were capable of doing though at the time that they were doing it, and how much of that is still standing. It's unbelievable. Rome's one of the most amazing historical places you can go and see.
And even not being religious, I even enjoyed the Vatican as well. Just the money and the wealth and the, I don't know what the word is, but the gravitas behind everything there, it's just amazing, unbelievable. Yeah,
it is amazing. I think they got all that, how they were able to build that. I mean, they were able to build it because they stole a lot of money from all over Europe and brought it back to Rome. But it's still pretty amazing when you see the St. Peter's Basilica inside. It's pretty crazy.
I know, unbelievable. So just before we finish off, mate, if people are interested in some of the stuff we've been talking about, I know you've reeled off a few names already, but what are some good kind of books or people to look into or read up on?
It depends what kind of branch you're interested in. So if you want to think about metaphysics and that kind of branch of philosophy interests you, that kind of first principles, a good place to start is, because a lot of it's like inaccessible. A lot of it's really hard to, because it's all translated from 13th century German, and a really good place to start is David Hume. David Hume, Scottish philosopher, 17th century Scottish philosopher, and a great book called An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding. It's only short. It's really easy to understand. You'll recognise the book. It's got a picture of a billiards table on the front. It's a really kind of recognisable, important work in philosophy, and it's mainly about freedom and the idea that our actions might be determined. But that's a great starting point for philosophy, metaphysics, if you're interested in that. Any book, if you're interested in existentialism, any book by Albert Camus is a really a French philosopher called Albert Camus. He again wrote really short books, but novels, philosophy like kind of entwined in novels, which was something that the 20th century French philosophers used to do quite a lot. So like really, like it's really deep philosophy. It's really like complex philosophy, but written in a way that's actually accessible, as opposed to trying to read some of the German phenomenology and stuff like that. If you're trying to read Hegel and Heidegger and things like that, it's hard to kind of read it in the first place. But I'd say Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, Descartes' First Meditation is good, and any book by Albert Camus is probably the best places to start, I would say.
Who was the other guy you just said? Descartes? Yeah,
René Descartes. So
is that like, is it Descartes? Is that how it's spelt?
Yeah. Cartesius is called sometimes as well, was his Latin name that people call him.
I have come across his name before, but I didn't know it was pronounced like that. That was all. But Descartes,
He's the father of modern philosophy. He presented the problem of metaphysics that basically everybody from that point on, I think it's 1600s he was around, every single philosopher from that point on has basically tried to answer the problem that Descartes raised, which is, they call it the cogito. You probably heard the sentence before, I think, therefore I am.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, so that's the fundamental problem of metaphysics, of existence, of basically like you can't prove that nothing but you exists is the idea.
You just hurt me brain. I think, therefore I am.
Yeah, but better translated mostly is I think, therefore I exist. So if you've ever seen the film The Matrix, the Matrix is based on Descartes' philosophy.
Really?
Yeah, so the idea that your senses can deceive you at any moment, you can, if you've ever had a dream that you think is real, which is what they actually say in The Matrix, it's literally based on.
Yeah.
It's but how can you essentially can't prove anything, because all you know and all you acquire are through your senses, and your senses are flawed. Your senses tell you things that aren't true all the time. If you ever had a dream that you are sure was real when you were in it, how can you be sure that this moment now is not? And I know it's called radical doubt. So he knows he's being extreme with doubting it, but he says ultimately, To create a perfect system of knowledge, you have to have absolutely perfect knowledge, and knowing that you exist only as a thing that thinks is basically all you know, and all you can prove. And so from that point on in philosophy, everyone was basically just trying to solve that, the cogito, trying to solve that problem. And that's kind of what David Hume was trying to do, and John Locke and everybody who comes after him. So it's a bit more advanced than the other ones that I mentioned, but it's called the Meditation on First Philosophy. And that's René Descartes, and that's really interesting. But a bit of a headache in a book.
It's I've got a headache just off this conversation, but it's something I start to. I know the Matrix is quality as well. I love like trying to think about like some of the ideas behind that go on like in the Matrix film and that, like, powerful.
Yeah, it's basically the same thing.
If you knew that it was in a Matrix, though, which pill would you take?
I'd take which one's the one that sends me back to my normal life?
So I think the red one is the ignorance is bliss one, in it, so you forget about it and you just, the hamburger's the hamburger.
I'll take the red pill, I think.
The red pill.
It looked like a nicer world. I'd be that guy, you know, who's eating the steak, talking to the agent. Yeah, I know it's fake, but I love it. That's me. Taking that one, definitely.
There's one thing that I've been thinking about, and I think I've read it in, it might have been a Jordan Peterson book, but he talks about how flawed we are as humans, in that our sight, like a bit like we spoke about before, we can't see the full spectrum of colours. Our hearing, we've not got the full audible pitches. We can only hear a certain amount of pitches is the right word, isn't it? We can only hear a certain amount of pitches. Yeah. With our sight, hearing. So how can we think that we are, what we see is all there is, if we can only see a certain percentage of like visual, hearing, seeing? You know what I mean? I think they were saying like bees see all the electromagnetic waves that are around. That's what they see when they look around, but we can't see anything like that.
Yeah, like, you know, birds have, you know, and dogs have that sense of smell that they can pick up things that we don't even know.
So that's another sense, the sense of smell, I know. But yeah, we think we're this all being all powerful thing, but yeah, we're actually limited in what we can perceive when we look at things, when we look at the world.
Hyper limited, aren't we? We're super limited to things, and maybe there's, you know, something else out there that can perceive a reality that, you know, that we can't. Maybe.
Yeah. It kind of brings us back to the one of the opening statements that you made, that quoting whoever it was who said it, that I know that I don't know. We need to be more maybe open-minded and question that. Yeah, well, actually, I don't know shit really.
That's where you got to start in philosophy. Really, that's the kind of the starting point of it. Is, you know, I don't know anything. I don't know jack shit. So.
Madness. Well, you've certainly given me some good stuff to think about there, mate, and I'm definitely going to be picking up some of them books for have a read. But I don't know if there's anything else you want to touch on before we go.
No, I mean, I think I've probably bored people for long enough now.
It's like I said, I mean, it's something that's interested me, and I'm not academic whatsoever. And if it interests me, the chances are it's going to be interesting to somebody else as well. Like, so hopefully it'll start asking people to start asking themselves questions, and that's what it's ultimately all about. If we can improve ourselves more than we were yesterday, not comparing ourselves to others, but comparing ourselves to how I was yesterday, ultimately we can be better. So
absolutely,
that's the idea behind it. Like,
well, thanks for asking us on, Dave. I appreciate it. It was nice talking to you.
Yeah, no, it's been a good conversation, mate. Yeah, it's been good. So we'll end there, mate. Thanks very much for coming on.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Dave. Cheers.
Right, mate. No worries, Rob. See you soon, mate.
See you soon.